kind of dispatch. We will leave us a television to relax, enjoy it, and she can be fashionably late and make the revision together. Alicia. It was very nice. Look at that. You don't even need to talk. I mean, you don't even need to speak. You're already getting applauses.
Is this on?
I think so, yeah.
Is this on?
She's giving a little introduction.
Yeah, I know. Okay.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the New Museum. I'm so thrilled to welcome you here for tonight's conversation with the one and only Judy Chicago. My name's Alethea Rockwell, and I'm the Keith Haring Director of Education and Public Engagement here. I'll start with a land acknowledgement to recognize and remember that the new museum sits on the unceded land of the Lenape, the original inhabitants of the island of Mannahatta, here in Lenapehoking. So as we gather tonight, we begin by paying our respects to the Lenape people, past, present, and future. I'm so thrilled that we're all here in this packed theater, and I also want to welcome the audience that is joining us virtually via live stream. There's so much interest in tonight's talk, and I think it's a testament to how meaningful Judy Chicago's work is to so many people. She really needs no introduction. Her 60-year career is legendary in feminist art and activism, and her work challenging the institutions of art and art history has paved the way for so many women in this field. It's a legacy that's really deeply felt here at the New Museum, as a museum founded and run by the collective efforts of so many women and gender nonconforming people. So thank you, Judy. And her exhibition, Herstory, opened today. Woo! And she will be in conversation now with Massimiliano Gioni, the New Museum's Edlis Neeson Artistic Director. Massimiliano co-organized the exhibition with curators Margot Norton, Gary Carrion Murayari, and Madeline Weisberg. And you have a chance to see the exhibition after the talk, because we're open until 9 p.m. tonight, and I also encourage you to come back and join us for upcoming programs. We have a free day on November 5th for families to be inspired by Judy's work. We also have some public programs, November 9th, artists responding to her Birth Project series, and December 14th, thinking about environmentalism and feminism in Judy's work and beyond. And before we get started, I'd like to thank the education staff here who makes these programs happen, in particular, Austin D. Bowes and Derek Wright. And thank you, Judy. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your exhibition, and thank you for your vision for a feminist world.
Thank you.
With that, I'll pass it over to Massimiliano.
Thank you, Alethea. And thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Judy. I always joke that the lighting is designed by the NSA.
You said it.
But it makes us look good for the people at home. And I want to thank the whole New Museum. As I hope many of you have seen, it's really a great exhibition, and one that required a lot of work and effort and coordination. So we're very thankful to you, Judy, again, for letting us display your work here, and to the entire team and the entire institution that brought it together. It's completely unrehearsed, and I'm completely unprepared, and I want to start actually with a very simple but perhaps deep question, which is, who is an artist for you? Or what is an artist?
What is an artist, or who is an artist?
Your choice.
Why do you want to ask me that question?
Because I think that your answer might lead us to understand how you made your work and what expectations you put towards being an artist, what hopes moved you when you wanted to become an artist.
Well, as I think you know, I never wanted to be anything but an artist. I started drawing before I started talking, and I started studying art when I was 5. And I not only always wanted to be an artist, but as I know you also know, my father raised me with the idea that the purpose of life is to make a contribution. And so it was interesting, you know, the retrospective doing this with you, Massimiliano, has caused me to think about a lot of things, like the fact that when I was 17 and still living in Chicago before I left to go to California for college, I used to go to the dunes, which were on the edge of Lake Michigan in the summers, and there were other kids that I grew up with there. And I don't know what prompted me to say this when I was 17, but I said that I had a destiny, which I guess I knew even then. And I wasn't quite sure what it was, except it was, you know, to become part of art history and to try and make a contribution to change, which is what my father raised me to do. It was interesting. When I went to the Art Institute, when I was a teenager, I had a teacher who I studied with, I think, from the time I was 11 till I left at 17. And when the dinner party went to Chicago, to a totally alternative space, he was still alive, and I took him to the dinner party. I walked around with him. He spoke in a very soft voice. And he said to me, I always knew you were going to do something important. So I didn't exactly know what I was going to do, and the one thing I didn't know was what challenges I was going to encounter in trying to do it. So in a way, this show and this moment, October 2023, has a lot of resonance not only for me, but for some of the people in the audience who were at the dinner party opening in 1980, and a friend of mine, ours, in Texas, who mounted the first grassroots alternative exhibition of the dinner party when it was the piece that everybody wanted to see and nobody wanted to show. After it opened and was savaged by Hilton Kramer at the Times and Robert Hughes in Time magazine, he was probably one of the most important critics in the country. And Robert Hughes described the dinner party as nothing but vaginas on plates. And Hilton Kramer described the dinner party that way. And Robert Hughes wrote, if only the needleworkers could have done their own designs, which betrayed a total lack of understanding of the history of needlework, because historically needleworkers work from patterns. They don't do their own designs. Some do now, but anyway, this is a roundabout way of answering your question, okay? When the dinner party impelled people around the world to organize and establish their own organizations and sometimes their own institutions in order to bring the dinner party on a worldwide tour to a viewing audience of 1 million people, I saw the power of art, the potential power of art. I always believed in art, but that was something quite different. To see art inspiring action, where people sent checks to their local museums, like canceled checks, like telling them they were not supporting them because they wouldn't bring a piece they wanted to see to their community. And that dramatically expanded my idea about what an artist is. To make me feel like art can be such an important part of human life, and that artists have an obligation to think beyond the marketplace. No. There was no marketplace when I started out in LA. And when people say to me, oh, isn't it horrible you've had to wait so long for recognition? First of all, recognition was not my goal. I had a different set of goals, which was to make change and to make a contribution. And I'm like, are you kidding me? I had 5 solid decades of working in my studio without ever thinking about the market, which is unthinkable for young artists now. It's only in the last 10 years when Donald and I realized it's no fun to be in America without any money that we even started thinking about money. Yeah. So does that answer your question?
It does.
Was probably not the answer you anticipated.
No. It makes me want to ask you a lot of other questions. I'll try to remember them all.
I have a question for you.
Sure. But
actually,
they are going to cancel their checks if we waste time with my answers.
No, because people know that I am interested in conversation, not in hearing my own voice. Yeah. which I've heard quite a lot of this week. Okay. As you know, I have followed your career since you did the Great Mother show in Milan, which taught me a big lesson. When I was working on I've told you this, but the audience probably doesn't know this, and
Maybe
also
they don't want to hear it, but it's it's okay. Sorry.
it's really hard for me to look at the audience because of the lights in my eyes. Yeah, so if I don't look at you, it's because if I have to look at Massimiliano or I'm going to go blind. When I did the Birth Project in the 1980s, as you know, I do a lot of research before I take up a subject. And I thought at that time there were no images of birth in contemporary art. It was before Frida Kahlo's My Birth. It was a time when she was referred to as Diego Rivera's wife, who also paints. Actually, Donald and I, my husband, had an experience some time ago when this show opened of the, quote, masters that, of course, they had to have Frida Kahlo into. And his sister was there, and we met her. And she's like, I want to see Diego get out from under Frida's skirts. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because she was under his very large shadow for a very long time. Anyway, so it was because I thought there were no images of birth that I had to go to direct experience, like witness a birth. I was fortunately in the Bay Area, which was the center of the alternative birth movement at that time. So there were a lot of people who wanted to share their pictures and their videos, and I also interviewed women, but had to do something that's very unusual in art, which is to invent the iconography, because I didn't have an image bank to draw on except for early goddess-related imagery. So Donald and I came, as you know, went to Milan to see your show. And it was a revelation to me because you had put together evidence that there had been images of birth from the beginning of the 20th century and in all of the various movements, Dada, Surrealism. And, you know, I knew all about the erasure of women's achievements, but what your show taught me was that there are other forms of erasure by the patriarchal paradigm, including the erasure of subject matter that hasn't been considered important because it's what women do. Okay, so that's what I followed your career then, since then. So what prompted you a year ago, August, to call me up and say, what would you think if I did a show of your work occupying the whole museum?
Well, I don't think it's so important, so I'll try to keep it very...
I think it's really important.
I mean, what prompted me is that your work is incredible and deserving of being seen and known by more people. It's also, you are a figure who has attained the status of a national treasure. You know, in Japan, people can become national treasures. There is a beautiful little film by Tastadin that filmed the national treasure. She has to do it in clandestine manner. And I think you are a national treasure, and you are a living legend, and it doesn't happen often for a curator to have the honor and the possibility to work with an artist of your status and to learn so much about your experience and become somehow a custodian of that experience. I'm partial also to artists whose work is outside the canon, so to speak, or still, you know, polemical about it. And I love artists and artworks that tell stories, and your work does that. And we'll get to that maybe in a few minutes. And also you are an artist who had to rebuild the house of American art so that you and many people like you could live in it. And I think that's very special and makes your work, you go through the show and you see an artist who's making the art, but then had to have an entire parallel career as an historian, an archivist, an activist, an organizer, because there was no place where your work would be seen, and not just your work, the work of your friends and peers. And so that also gives us an opportunity, and it's no exaggeration to say that, speaking of maternity, you've given birth to the world of art as we know it, and the world of art in which I want to live, which is, it's no exaggeration to say that a museum like this wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Judy Chicago and some other artists like you. So for all these reasons, we're doing the show, and I think up there it also proves that, that the work standard. Now, I'll just turn the question around to you, because you...
Because you're a control freak and you can't...
No, because it's about you, it's not about me.
Yes, no,
so
Massimiliano, that's not true. That's really not true. Because what you've done is you've created a historic context for my work to be understood, and more importantly, you have helped me introduce the idea that there is an entire alternative historical canon and structure, and it challenges the patriarchal structure that has been considered art history.
Yeah, but that I learned from you and your work. So, when you talk about the Birth Project and the show, The Great Mother, the Birth Project was foundational for that show. And, so much of what we see upstairs is what you taught and learned in the past 6 decades. And actually, if you want to know something that makes me look less than a fool or more of a fool now, is speaking of erasure, I've been thinking about it every minute going through the second floor, which is a remarkable floor. I never liked to, this maybe you're not gonna like, I don't believe in quality when it comes to art, because I think in the name of quality, then you just bound to repeat the taste of others and, accept hierarchies that are often restrictive. So I often say, quoting the artist Thomas Hirschon, energy yes, quality no. So I look for, intensities more than beauty or quality, and that I think opens the doors to very interesting accidents, because if you only invite artists based on quality, I would have missed out on, and don't get me wrong, I love your work, but I would have played with accepted categories. But so you go through the second floor and you wonder, how on earth aren't all these works in the most important museums in the world? And the answer we all know is because you are a woman and you are a feminist. And there is no reason why, the first room or the second room on the right or the second on the left should not be, in the most important and prestigious museums. And sadly, only 3 of those works are in public museums. And they're not, now one of them is at the Whitney Museum, but all the others are not in the most important museums in the world. So the answer, though, to that, and this is where also, we come to the truth of it, is that even a person like me who loves art, who's been interested in art as a teenager, who grew up loving art, and I was probably aware of what primary structures was since the 60s, since I was 16 or thereabout. I did not know that Judy Chicago was in primary structures until I started paying attention to your work. Not until I met you, but until I had to go through a revision of my ideas and search for the evidence of those exclusions. I find that is completely mind-blowing, that, an expert who was familiar with art, had read, he was inspired to become a curator by Lucy Lippard and blah, 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 and who knew that Bob Morris was in primary structures, that Donald Judd was in primary structure, that Robert Smithson was in, but I knew maybe when you learn the teams of soccer games. I didn't know 39 of those guys, but I probably knew a good 10 or 15. I had no idea that Judy Chicago was in it. How is that possible? That is a big question that I want to ask you. Because you know, going through this show, so what I learned is, and that applies also to Frida Kahlo, to Mina Loy, to Leonora Carrington, to Sophie Tauber-Arp. They were there, you know. They are in the pictures next to Breton, next to Marcel Janco or Tristan Tzara. They are in the mix as the art historical event is happening. But then they are not in the record until 20 years ago or until 30 years ago. So.
And then there's always the shock.
Yeah.
That's what gets me mad. So, oh, there were women. Oh, really? Oh, there's another woman. I mean, it's like, give me a break. Anyway, I do want to address this because it's not just that the patriarchal canon has erased women when history is written. It's even now when the patriarchal paradigm is desperately in the major institutions, it's desperately trying to add women, non-binary people, people across the gender spectrum, artists of color, to the edges of that paradigm. The way the work is presented, well, it's twofold. One has to do with somebody saying something about, oh, it's so generous of you to include other women, no male artists would do it. I'm like, a male artist doesn't have to do it. You walk into a museum and in your mind is Michelangelo and Leonardo and blah, 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 who led to blah, 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 who led to blah, 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 who led to Richard Serra. I mean, it's, you take it in with you. And with women artists, we don't have that. We have absence in terms of what women artists did. And even if we're familiar with a few of them, they are dwarfed by this monumental paradigm that is construed to be art history. So I believe in quality, by the way. I just don't believe that the prevailing art critics have the right to tell me what quality is. What I want is I want institutions diverse, egalitarian, and representative. And then I want to go in and look at Lucian Freud next to Alice Neal, and I want to make up my own mind about which one has quality. I don't want to be told what quality is. And that's how art history is taught. You are told by your professors what quality is. And that, again, translates into your experience of looking and experiencing art.
This leads me to a question that was suggested also by your first answer, which is the role of language in your own work. You know, I was thinking again, going through the show, there is actually a lot of written language in the paintings, and that was also a big unorthodox thing to do, no? And particularly such an ornate and feminine style. And you have, I teased you, saying that for a marginalized artist, you have, 15 books under your belt? and a few, how many editions of your biography? I mean, writing and language has always been important. You also, and this is the beauty of working with an artist of your stature, you have Anais Nin telling you to become a writer and writing the preface for your first novel. So I'm curious about how and if language played a role both in your formation, in your life. Was that a tool that you had to to use again because you had to write your own history and, to write yourself, as sometimes is said about.
I want to answer that in two parts. Yes, I first wrote because of Edlis Neeson, because it was a taboo when I was coming up for an artist to do anything in the LA art scene but make art. That would, if you could write, that would cast doubt on the fact that you might be a serious artist. It's like, if anybody visited me in the 60s, I would never even serve them a cup of tea because that would disqualify me. Oh, she's just a woman. She's the wife or groupie, blah, blah, blah. So I never thought about writing. But when the women's movement started at the end of the 60s, and I was reading all this literature where women were talking about the kind of experiences they were having, which was exactly like the experiences I had been having. And when I left LA to try and figure out how to create a feminist art practice and to start working with young women in the hopes of helping them be able to make art where they didn't have to deny their gender like I did. We published an issue of a feminist newsletter, and I had begun to talk about what I had been experiencing in the LA art scene, which was singularly inhospitable to women. And I wrote an essay called My Struggle as a Woman Artist, which Anais somehow read. And when I met her and she started inviting me to visit her, it was when her diaries were first being published. And she was just emerging from decades of invisibility. She told me I could write. But I was struggling at that point to figure out what I should do. Should I give up painting? Should I do performance? Should I do video? What should I do? What would be the best way to be able to express all this stuff that I couldn't express in the minimal framework I was trying to force everything into as a way of like getting taken seriously as an artist? And she told me, you can't do everything, but you can write your way through everything, which is how I started, why I wrote my first book, to think my way through all these potential new choices. But then, what happened was nobody would write about my work, so I had to write about my own work. It was even about, like, how people see, talk about me being a curator. Nobody would organize shows. I didn't even know it was odd for an artist to kind of curate her own show. I was so out of it. I was so out of the art world, marginalized. But now I want to talk about another aspect about text. I find it very interesting that Ed Riche's show, I know Ed from LA. We came up together. I'm fond of Ed. Actually, I've seen a lot of the guys from that era, and I say to them, you guys really gave me a hard time, but after 50 years, I'm kind of fond of you. Just because we've been around so long. But in all the articles I've read, nobody talks about his use of text. 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 His work is all about text, but it's all typeset. And it's distant, and it's formal. And my text is handwritten and personal and emotive. And so everybody talks about my text.
Yeah. Well, but because also we had a great show with Faith Ringgold, and in interesting ways there are similarities between your two careers, because also Faith had to work very hard to build houses and open doors and windows. And she also brought text, and somehow cursive text. Cursive italics actually meant little text from the Italian, no? So maybe of small importance. And it was so much about herself as much as your text is about yourself. I think in the Room of 70s painting, I forgot what's the title of the one we have on the right.
Reincarnation triptych.
Yeah, the fourth one with the black frame. You know, it's so personal. You're talking about your body.
Oh no, the liberation of the great ladies.
Yeah, liberation of great ladies. You're talking about your body. You're talking about, you know, it's very much in first person singular. And so I'm also curious, you know, he participates in this moment of maybe confession and rediscovery of the self that was also very much in the air, I think, in California, no? And probably that's also why it's dismissed as feminine or dismissed as too personal. And but I think now he has a charge that also connects it to recent experiences in writing, like, you know, the whole notion of autofiction. I see it coming out of artists like you or artists like Faith Ringgold, now this idea of mixing the personal and the fictional. And so did you have models for that type of writing aside from Ice or?
No. I think I told you about this. I had this very odd and pivotal experience in the early 70s when I was working on the great ladies, and that when I was first trying to figure out how to use my abstract form language to represent specific women in history who I was discovering. And I did a lecture, because I was lecturing about my work quite a lot then. I did a lecture at a university. I can't remember if it was in North or South Dakota, but it was somewhere out there in the middle of nowhere. But there were 200 people in the audience. And I showed the great ladies' paintings. And, you know, I've always done things like I asked the audience afterwards what they thought. And this guy stood up in the back and he said, you know, I found what you said about your intentions really interesting. But if I looked at the paintings, I wouldn't know what your intention was. Well, that was really interesting to me, because what that meant to me at that time was that I didn't yet have a form language that could clearly, a visual form language that could clearly express the content in the work. So I started actually, even before like the reincarnation triptych where there's a border of writing, like the great ladies, when I first installed them, I used to write on the wall. In fact, Diane Gallen, who's here and who has worked with me for 50 years, she used to go with me to exhibitions and help fill in the letters on the wall. And then I did little porcelain miniatures where I wrote around the image to try and make the image clearer to viewers. And that's how I started doing it.
Well, I mean, when it comes to language, I think you're the only person I know that chose her own name, no, and renamed yourself, and did so also paradoxically in written form, no, the Arforum ad, in which you declare you are divesting yourself from names imposed on you by male social dominance. It is a birth through language, no? It's giving birth to yourself through language. And how did that come about? I mean, you talked about Ed Ruscha, the Ferus Gallery, which I think must have been an incredible sentimental education for a young artist like you. Now, the Ferus guys, they were famous for their ads in our forum, no? The Ed Ruscha Ferus Gallery show, right. It's a photo of himself in bed with two women, right, and says, say goodbye to college days. No? Right. Right. And then there is the studs. Studs, right. Social, what is it?
The studs were for the Ferris boys, and there was Larry Bell with a big cigar, and there was Kenny Price on a surfboard, and there was Billy Al Bengtson on his motorcycle. And I mean, I hung out with those guys. And the art form ad, like a lot of things, you know, people are always ascribing intention the things that end up being controversial. that I had no intention of being controversial. That's
Yeah.
okay. So I had a show actually of the Fresno fans and the Flesh Gardens at a gallery in Orange County. And the gallery owner wanted to do an ad. And he had an idea for an ad that would be me in a boxing ring. I thought it was great and hilarious because it was a takeoff on The Boys, right? So I'm like, okay, cool. So we go downtown LA to a gym, and I thought the guys there, because this is before female boxers, I thought they were going to have a heart attack when I walked in, you know, with a sweatshirt that he had emblazoned with Judy Chicago and gym shorts and like big boots and boxing gloves. I mean, so we take the picture by a photographer who came from Oklahoma with Ed Richey to LA named Jerry McMillan. In fact, when I ran into him at the opening of Pacific Standard Time, he said to me, "Do you know how much money that picture has made for me?" But anyway, so at the time, Art Forum was in LA, and it was run by, the editor was a guy named Phil Leader. This was like, you know, the beginning of all the radical movements, many of which started in California. And he started a column, a section called Politics. And he tried to get Jack Glenn, my dealer, to run this ad. I mean, run the announcement as a full-page ad, and he wouldn't do it. So Phil Leader printed it for nothing. And it happened to coincide with a moment in the early 70s when a lot of women in the art world were getting fed up and were about to come out fighting.
You know, we included those two ads in this section that we call gender games, which was a way also to point to the fact that unlike some later criticism in the 70s that identify you as in very arcane languages, you know, when you look back in retrospect, some of these fights seem a little ridiculous, but, you know, Judy was criticized for being an essentialist, meaning that she was believed to associate womanhood with biology rather than with culture, to oversimplify. And we wanted actually to stress how you, from the very beginning, had been aware of gender as a construction, gender as a pose, as a performance. And so in that gallery, we look at those works, we look at those strange board games that, to me, seem to make fun of minimalism by turning it into a dollhouse game, no? And they are so much about strategy. They're like about power relationships, but the power relationships are unclear because it's a chess board with no rules, no? And so at that time, you must have been thinking a lot about gender. Maybe it wasn't even called that back then. I'm curious if this is a very stupid question, but did you believe back then and do you believe now that art has a gender? It's a question that Lucy Lippard wrote a whole book around.
Art doesn't have gender, but artists do. And, you know, when I was in my studio, I wasn't thinking, I'm a woman. I was being an artist. But as soon as I walked out my studio door, I was hit in the face with gender issues. You can't be a woman and an artist too. You know, you're like the fact that even though I was in primary structures, like I watched all my male peers on the choo-choo train. You know, they'd be in a big show, and then they'd get a gallery, and then they'd sell their work, and then they'd get a Guggenheim. I mean, I applied to the Guggenheim 14 times. And at a point, they just go, no. So no, I'm not applying anymore. So anyway, my gender was hitting me in the face constantly. And that's one of the reasons I decided at the end of my first decade of practice that I am going to deal with gender historically, philosophically, metaphysically. I'm going to explore it. And I spent 15 years exploring the construct of femininity before it was called that. It used to be called female role. And then one day I woke up and I thought, women aren't the problem. And so then I started thinking, this is like the early 80s, you know, before there was queer theory, before there was masculinity studies, before there was any of that, I started thinking about masculinity, the construct of masculinity. I go to the library, I look up gender, and only books about women come up, because at that point, gender was considered to belong, we're gendered, you're not, right? And so, of course I understood that gender was a construct. There just wasn't that kind of theoretical language that there is now. But actually, I think we should talk a little bit about our discussion around your wanting to create this category called gender games. And this is where having a really, really good curator makes an enormous difference. Because one of the things you said to me as you were studying my career was that many of the exhibitions that were organized once other people started organizing exhibitions, and I didn't have to do my own, was that they were almost always from my point of view, which I had recorded in books, so it was easy to get access to it. But you brought an entirely different point of view. And the thing about gender games, like, I didn't really see the board games and the rearrangeables that way, but you showed me that that's what they were about. I mean, you know, I knew that the rearrangeables, even the rearrangeability of 10-part cylinders in the show, grew out of my conditioning as a woman, because I was brought up to rearrange my life to fit around men's needs. And one of the reasons I stopped doing that work was because, like, I'm not going to do that anymore. So, but I was obviously already trying to figure out, by rearranging these forms, you know, how to change the arrangement, okay? So you were the one who gave me insight into some of that work. And same thing with the domes. Like, I remember when I did all the domes, which were three rounded forms, and I had a little show set up of them in Pasadena, and Irving Blum, the famous dealer from Ferris, came to see them, and he walked in and he said, "Ah, the Venus of Willendorf." And I was like, oh my God, no, oh my God. I mean, that was not a compliment, believe me. It was not a compliment. It was like branding me, gendering me, right?
Yeah. The George O'Keeffe model, no, that refused actually that reading. It's
yes,
as you well know, because you approached her about it, and,
right?
And she.
But actually, Massimiliano was talking about the fact that when I wrote my first book, Through the Flower, I reproduced work by women artists, and I wrote to O'Keeffe. I was living in California, she was in New Mexico. I wrote to O'Keeffe and I asked her if I could reproduce Black Iris, and she said no, because she didn't want to be identified with other women. So actually, Massimiliano borrowed Black Iris from the Metropolitan in
it goes back to
demonstration of what goes around comes around. But when
I keep score a lot.
But when I was at the opening the other night, you know, and because a lot of people, you know, I spent the entire time of the opening on the 4th floor. In fact, I told Massimiliano to please set up a bed for me because I was moving into the 4th floor. Because seeing all that work that I've carried in my mind, in my heart, in real, has been just completely overwhelming to me. But so I'm standing with some friends in front of Agnes Pelton, Hilma af Klint, Georgia O'Keeffe, and I told this story about how she wouldn't reproduce, let me reproduce it, and I'm like, look at those paintings, she's a girl, whether she wanted to be identified as such or not.
Well, I'll ask you something though now, because that grouping is actually quite stunning, and particularly after you've seen your 70s paintings downstairs, it's, whether or not there is such a thing as what you call central core imagery, certainly you see that there is a tradition of abstraction. And you told me something, I can't phrase it exactly as you did, but that, and you've written about it, that for you abstraction was a language that had to be invented by women so they could talk about an experience that no other language would allow them to. And we have, Hildegard of Bingen, those are also cosmologies and shapes of the world that resemble both carnal and spiritual experiences.
But of course, until the Hilma af Klint show at the Guggenheim, there was no acknowledgement that women invented abstraction, right?
Well, she was shown here in 2016.
What?
She was shown at the New Museum before the Guggenheim.
Really?
Yes, and at the Venice Biennale in 2013. But what I want to ask is this, because O'Keeffe, I recently was looking at this book about Kusama for her show in Hong Kong, and there are the letters that Kusama writes to O'Keeffe, and she sends her drawings. And it must have been amazing and horrible to be, the only woman to whom all the other women artists wrote, asking for help, asking, to become a role model for many generations of women. And so I want to ask you, because also now you are a role model since a few decades yourself, does that come as a burden to you, this kind of, you are an artist who is an artist but also has the burden of being representing something, which, I don't know if Ed Ruscha has that burden of, being himself and an expression of a category. So how does that feel, and how did it feel even in the 70s when you were, a professor, a teacher, and again, a role model of some sort?
It's very funny about people's thing about my teaching. I have actually spent 6 years total in institutional teaching. That's it.
Yeah.
I mean, I've tried to teach through my art, but like my husband, Donald, I am not very well attuned to institutions. I'm like, I don't fit in them. I'm too much of a troublemaker. No, but anyway, about being a role model. I didn't have any role models because, I grew up with Jansen, where the only woman mentioned in Jansen was the Virgin Mary, and she was not exactly a role model for me. And, I didn't have any role models. At art school, most of the teachers were men. Art history classes, most of the art was by men. All, in fact, I think. So I definitely felt an absence, which is one of the reasons Anna Easton was so important to me. Since I've written so many books and documented my struggle and documented how I faced and overcame the challenges, I have to tell you, it's aggravating to me, like when young women ask me for like a 1-word or 1-sentence piece of advice. I'm like, do research. Research. I did research. I did years of research to find out how women before me overcame the obstacles they encountered. I mean, our studio manager, Megan Schultz, gets hundreds of letters asking for advice. And she says, research. Research. Judy has a research portal that it represents the archives at 5 different institutions. Go to the research portal. Ask the Schlesinger Library for blah, blah, blah. They'll pull it up for you because the archive is digitized. But, I mean, I know everybody is raised on Google, but I don't like being Google. That's my answer.
Actually, though, I've been thinking a lot about
We
it.
not finished a half hour yet?
No, we
45 minutes,
we
right?
want to hear more. Yes. No, let's see, actually, if there are questions from the audience. But speaking of archive, I thought a lot going through the show that sadly that was also a result of a marginalization, that, you know, you could have a lot of time to preserve the documents around you, to reassess your own history.
What do you mean? I'd have to read my own archives. Who does that?
No, but that you had the opportunity to preserve and organize your archive because maybe there was less distraction from the market, from the shows.
I cannot take a lot of credit for that. Although I was totally determined not to have my work erased. I've had a lot of people around me who, like, what does Donald say? When we got married 38 years ago, he was advised not to let me throw everything away by people who felt that what a lot of the material that I didn't always evaluate properly needed to be cared for and archived. And my determination to not have my work erased came from my study of women's history and discovering how many women had been erased. Although it's not like the information's not there. It's there. It's like you said, it's just left out at the point at which it becomes documented history. So I was determined not to let that happen to me. And then I had an experience when I was working on the dinner party that made that determination even more determined, which was I was included in a show called Creativity that was sponsored by Chevron. It was a traveling show, and it chronicled the work of like 16, quote, creatives. And I was the only woman. So, of course, when the designers came to talk to me, I gave them grief about that. And one of the young designers, who then ended up working on the Birth Project, doing all the exhibition design, Stephen Hamilton, he said to me that the criteria for inclusion was that you not only had to have created something of significance, you had to have documented it. And they could not find a lot of women who had done that. Now, that's a reflection of women not believing what they're doing is sufficiently important to document, okay? And I was fortunate to have people around me who felt that what I was doing and what they were doing with me was important and needed to be documented. So, also somebody told me something when I first started my career. I can't remember who it was. They said, when you do the first work that you consider professional quality, make a card and attach a slide. In those days we had slides. Attach a slide, which is how it happened that I created this whole immense card file.
But then your first work of significance, you say, is when you were 4 years old. So
That didn't get documented so much.
So let's see if there are some questions. And thank you so much, Judy. This, literally, we can go on for hours, but.
Okay, now I'm old, so we can only have a few questions because I'm getting tired.
Raise your hands and wait for the microphone so we.
Could you stand up and introduce yourself? That's not on.
Oh, I think it works now. Okay, so I'm just a common New Yorker.
What's your name?
Oh, Sabine. My name is Sabine, and I want to thank you, Sarah, for inviting me to this conversation. And my question is a little bit similar to the curator. So curator talk about like role model. So I want to talk about labels because when I read the articles about you, I saw you rejected to join a California woman like group exhibition show because you say you don't want to join any group identify themselves as women, Jewish, or California. You say like when we grew up, we lose all labels. So now when we talk about you, we will think you as a pioneering artist in feminist. So this is a label. We will think about you have rebuilt like American art history. That is another label. How do you think about this label right now?
I think I was a very foolish young woman. I mean, are you gonna like get pissed off at me about what I did in my 20s when I'm in my 80s? Come on. You change when you grow up.
Another question. We have one in the front that I noticed. And
Who are you?
My name is Susan Sabatino. I'm in the middle of reading 9th Street Women, which is all about the women of the abstract expressionist movement in New York. And they faced a lot of erasure and a lot of being sublimated to the men, not being considered artists, not being shown. You're 80, okay. Did you know any of these, like Elaine de Kooning? Did you hang out with them?
No, I didn't know them, but I knew about them, of course. I did know Miriam Shapiro, who was the next generation, and I worked with her, and I know what she went through. I was completely aware of it, believe me.
Yeah. I mean, their struggle was
Just
unbelievable.
But their struggles have to be looked at
Right.
in centuries of struggles, of women not being able to get art training, of women's work being consigned to the decorative. And one of the problems is that their experiences are looked at as if they're singular. They're not singular. It's part of a whole historic pattern.
It's true.
I see one over there. Two more, Judy.
Yeah, two more.
Two more. Maybe three.
Who are you? Who are you? Great jacket.
Thank you. My name is Michal, and I read in your biography that your father came from a family of rabbis, and I want to know how did it shape your art and your life?
What did she ask me?
That she read in your biography that your father came from a family of rabbis, and so if that experience shaped your art and your life.
The answer is yes and no. Okay, my father came from 23 generations of rabbis, and he was supposed to carry on the family tradition, but he rebelled, and his father, who was a rabbi, used to chase him around the dining room table with a belt, trying to force him to go to Cheder, but he wouldn't go. So instead, he became a labor organizer. And what can I tell you? When Donald and I were working on the Holocaust Project, Rabbi said Moses was the first labor organizer. So, but my father's relationship to being Jewish consisted of this. he and my mother, when they were courting, used to go to my grandmother's house for dinner on Friday night. And after one dinner, my mother said to my father, "Do you want me to learn to cook Jewish food?" And my father said, my mother was Jewish, but she didn't know how. And my father said, "No, Jewish food makes me sick." So, however, even though that's true in terms of one aspect of my childhood, my family, although I didn't understand it until Donald and I took up the Holocaust Project and our study of our history as Jews and what had happened during the Second World War, which both of us knew very little about because it wasn't spoken about or taught when we were in school. I was raised in a family that was suffused with Jewish values. Even the idea of making a contribution, and also the idea of choosing life. So I came to understand that, for example, if you've seen the show, upstairs there's a stained glass window called Rainbow Shabbat, which poses the Friday night Jewish Sabbath dinner as a metaphor for global healing and sharing. And it expresses something in Jewish culture called tikkun olam. I was raised with the values of tikkun olam, and they have definitely shaped my work. Okay, one more question.
And then don't hate us. We are going to leave from the side door and we are not going to sign autographs. So
That's right.
let her go because she has to. So last question.
Okay, thanks for coming.
Last question and then we sneak out. We have
Oh, one more? I didn't
I was
see
just
any
saying
hands.
to let you go and not to stop you.
I didn't see any hands, so I thought
Okay.
I was off the hook.
Going. Is there one? No? Thank you so much.